At the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, global civilization faces a new breed of cataclysm. These coming apocalypses ridicule the norms and organizational structures of the politics which were forged in the birth of the nation-state, the rise of capitalism, and a 20th century for unprecedented wars. 2. Most significant is the breakdown of the planetary climatic system. In time, this threatens the continued existence of the present global human population. Though this is the most critical of the threats which face humanity, a series of lesser but potentially equally destabilizing problems exist alongside and intersect with it. Terminal resource depletion, especially in water and energy reserves, offers the prospect of mass starvation, collapsing economic paradigms, and a new hot and cold wars. Continued financial crisis has led governments to embrace the paralyzing death spiral policies of austerity, privatization of social welfare services, mass unemployment, and stagnating wages. Increasing automation in production processes, including, quote, intellectual labor, is evidence of the secular crisis of capitalism, soon to render it incapable of maintaining certain standards of living or even the former middle classes of the global north. 3. In contrast to these ever-accelerating catastrophes, today's politics is beset by an inability to generate the new ideas and modes of organization necessary to transform our society to confront and resolve the coming annihilations. While crisis gathers force and speed, politics withers and retreats. In the paralysis of the political imaginary, the future has been canceled. 4. Since 1979, the hegemonic global political ideology has been neoliberalism, found in some variant throughout the leading economic powers. In spite of the deep structural challenges the new global problems present to it, most immediately the credit, financial, and fiscal crisis since 2007 and 8, neoliberal programs have only evolved in the sense of deepening. This continuation of the neoliberal project, or neoliberalism 2.0, has begun to apply yet another round of structural adjustments, most significantly in the form of encouraging new and aggressive incursions by the private sector into what remains of social democratic institutions and services. This is in spite of the immediately negative economic and social effects of such policies and the longer-term fundamental barriers posed by the new global crises. 5. That the forces of right-wing governmental, non-governmental, and corporate power have been able to press forth with neoliberalism is at least in part the result of continued paralysis and ineffectual nature of much what remains of the left. 30 years of neoliberalism have rendered most left-leaning political parties bereft of radical thought, hollowed out, and without a popular mandate. At best, they have responded to our present crisis with calls for a return to Keynesian economics, in spite of the evidence that very conditions which enabled post-war social democracy to occur no longer exist. We cannot return to the mass industrial forced labor by fiat, if at all. Even the neo-socialist regimes of South America's Bolivian revolution, whilst heartening in their ability to resist the dogmas of contemporary capitalism, remain disappointingly unable to advance an alternative beyond mid-20th century socialism. Organized labor, being systematically weakened by the changes wrought and the neoliberal project, is sclerotic at an institutional level and at best capable only of mildly mitigating the new structural adjustments. But with no systematic approach to building a new economy or the structural solidarity to push such changes through, for now labor remains relatively impotent. The new social movements which emerged since the end of the Cold War, experiencing a resurgence in the years after 2008, have been similarly unable to devise a new political ideological vision. Instead, they expend considerable energy on internal direct democratic practices and effective self-valorization over strategic efficacy, and frequently propound a variant of neo-primitivist localism as if to oppose the abstract violence of globalized capital with the flimsy and ephemeral, quote, authenticity of communal immediacy. Number 6. In the absence of a radically new social, political, organizational, and economic vision, the hegemonic powers of the right will continue to be able to push forward their narrow-minded imaginary. In the face of any and all evidence, at best the left may be able for a time to partially resist some of the worst incursions. But this is to be canoe against an ultimately irresistible tide. To generate a new global hegemony entails a recovery of lost possible futures, and indeed the recovery of the future as such. Part 2 of the introduction. Interregnum on accelerationism. Number 1. If any system has been associated with the idea of acceleration, it is capitalism. The essential metabolism of capitalism demands economic growth with competition between individual capitalist entities settling in motion, increasing technological developments, and attempt to achieve competitive advantage, all accompanied by increasing social dislocation. In its neoliberal form, its ideological self-preservation is one of liberating the forces of creative destruction, setting free ever-accelerating technological and social innovations. 2. The philosopher Nick Land captured his most accurately with a myopic and hypnotizing belief that capitalist speed alone could generate a global transition towards unparalleled technological singularity. In this visioning of capital, the human can eventually be discarded as mere drag to an abstract planetary intelligence, rapidly constructing itself from the bright-legged fragments of former civilizations. However, Landian neoliberalism confuses speed with acceleration. We may be moving fast, but only within a strictly defined set of capitalist parameters that themselves never waver. We experience only the increasing speed of a local horizon, a simple brain-dead onrush rather than an acceleration which is also navigational, an experimental process of discovery within a universe space of possibility. It is the later mode of acceleration which we hold as essential. Number 3, even worse. As Deleuze and Guattari recognized from the very beginning, what capitalist speed deterritorializes with one hand, it reterritorializes with the other. Progress becomes constrained within a framework of surplus value, a reserve army of labor, and a free-floating capital. Modernity is reduced to statistical measures of economic growth, and social innovation becomes encrusted with kitsch remainders from our communal past. Thatcherite Reaganite deregulation sits comfortably alongside Victorian back-to-basics family and religious values. 4. A deeper tension with neoliberalism is in terms of its self-image as the vehicle of modernity, as literally synonymous with modernization, Willis promising a future that it is constitutively incapable of providing. Indeed, as neoliberalism has progressed rather than enabling individual creativity, it has tended towards eliminating cognitive inventiveness in favor of effective production line of scripted interactions coupled to global supply chains and a neo-Fordist Eastern production zone. A vanishingly small cognitariat of elite intellectual workers shrinks with each passing year, and increasingly so as algorithmic automation winds its way through the spheres of effective intellectual labor. Neoliberalism, though positing itself as necessary historical development, was in fact a merely contingent means to ward off the crisis of value that emerged in the 1970s. Inevitably, this was a sublimation of the crisis rather than its ultimate overcoming. 5. It is Marx, along with Land, who remains the paradigmatic accelerationist thinker. Contrary to the all too familiar critique, and even the behavior of some contemporary Marxians, we must remember that Marx himself used the most advanced theoretical tools and empirical data available in an attempt to fully understand and transform his world. He was not a thinker who resisted modernity, but rather one who sought to analyze and intervene within it, understanding that for all its exploitation and corruption, capitalism remained the most advanced economic system to date. Its gains were not to be reversed, but accelerated beyond the constraints the capital values form. 6. Indeed, as even Lenin wrote in the 1918 text, quote, left-wing childishness, quote, socialism is inconceivable without large-scale capitalist engineering based on the latest discoveries of modern science. It is inconceivable without planned state organization which keeps tens of millions of people to the strictest observance of a unified standard in production and distribution. We Marxists have always spoken of this, and it is not worthwhile wasting 2 seconds talking to people who do not understand even this. In parentheses, anarchists and a good half of the left socialist revolutionaries, end quote. 7. As Marx was aware, capitalism cannot be identified as the agent of true acceleration. Similarly, the assessment of left politics as antithetical to the techno-social acceleration is also, at least in part, a severe misinterpretation. Indeed, if the political left is to have a future, it must be one in which it maximally embraces this suppressed accelerationist tendency. Part 3 of the Manifesto on the Future. 1. We believe the most important division in today's left is being that those who hold to a folk politics of localism, direct action, and relentless horizontalism, and those that outline what must become called an accelerationist politics, at ease with a modernity of abstraction, complexity, globality, and technology. The former remains content with establishing small and temporary spaces of non-capitalist social relations, eschewing the real problems of entailed facing foes which are intrinsically non-local, abstract, and rooted deep in our everyday infrastructure. The failure of such politics has been built in from the very beginning. By contrast, an accelerationist politics seeks to preserve the gains of late capitalism while going further than its value system, governance structures, and mass pathologies will allow. 2. All of us want to work less. It is an intriguing question as to why it was that the world's leading economists of the post-war era believed that an enlightened capitalism invariably progressed towards a radical reduction of working hours. In the book, The Economic Prospects of Our Grandchildren, written in 1930, Keynes forecasts a capitalist future where individuals would have their work reduced to 3 hours a day. What has instead occurred is the progressive elimination of the work-life distinction, with work coming to permeate every aspect of the emerging social factory. 3. Capitalism has begun to constrain the productive forces of technology, or at least direct them towards needlessly narrow ends. Patent wars and idea monopolization are contemporary phenomena that point to both capital's need to move beyond completion and capital's increasingly retrograde approach to technology. The properly accelerative gains of neoliberalism have not led to less work or less stress. And rather than a world of space travel, future shock, and revolutionary technological potential, we exist in a time where the only thing which develops is marginally better consumer gadgetry. Relentless iterations of the same basic product sustain marginal consumer demands at the expense of human acceleration. 4. We do not want to return to Fordism. There can be no return to Fordism. The capitalist, quote, golden era was premised on the production paradigm of the orderly factory environment, where mostly white workers received security and a basic standard of living in return for a lifetime acidifying, boredom, and social repression. Such a system relied upon an international hierarchy of colonies, empires, and an underdeveloped periphery, a national hierarchy of racism and sexism, and a rigid family hierarchy of female subjugation. For all the nostalgia many may feel, the regime is both undesirable and practically impossible to return to. 5. Accelerationists want to unleash latent productive forces, and the project, the material platform of neoliberalism, does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be repurposed towards common ends. The existing infrastructure is not a capitalist stage to be smashed, but a springboard to launch towards post-capitalism. 6. Given the enslavement of technoscience to capitalist objectives, in parentheses, especially since the late 1970s, we surely do not yet know what a modern techno-social body can do. We amongst us fully recognize what untapped potentials await in the technology which has already been developed. Our wager is that the true transformative potential of much of our technological and scientific research remains unexploited, filled with presently redundant features, not pre-adaptations, that following a shift beyond the short-sighted capitalist socius can become decisive. 7. We want to accelerate the process of technological evolution, but what we are arguing for is not techno-utopianism. Never believe that technology will be sufficient to save us. Necessary, yes, but never sufficient without socio-political action. Technology and the social are immediately bound up with one another, and changes in either potentials and reinforce changes in the other. Whereas the techno-utopian argue for acceleration on the basis that it will automatically overcome social conflict, our position is that technology should be accelerated precisely because it is needed in order to win social conflicts. 8. We believe that any post-capitalism will require post-capitalist planning. The faith placed in the idea that after a revolution, the people will spontaneously constitute a novel socioeconomic system that isn't simply a return to capitalism is naive at best and ignorant at worst. To further this, we must develop both a cognitive map of the existing system and a speculative image of the future economic system. 9. To do so, the left must take advantage of every technological and scientific advantage made possible by capitalist society. We declare that qualification is not an evil to be eliminated, but a tool to be used in the most effective manner possible. Economic modeling is, simply put, a necessity for making intelligible a complex world. The 2008 financial crisis reveals the risks of blindly accepting mathematical models in faith, yet this is a problem of illegitimate authority, not of mathematics itself. The tools to be found in social network analysis, agent-based modeling, big data analytics, and non-equilibrium economic models are necessary cognitive mediators for understanding complex systems like the modern economy. The accelerationist left must become literate in these technical fields. 10. Any transformation of society must involve economic and social experimentation. The Chilean project Cybersyn is emblematic of the experimental attitude, fusing advanced cybernetic technologies with sophisticated economic modeling and a democratic platform instantiated in the technological infrastructure itself. Similar experiments were conducted in the 1950s and 60s. Soviet economies as well, employing cybernetics and linear programming in an attempt to overcome the problems faced by the first communist economy. That both of these were ultimately unsuccessful can be traced to the political and technological constraints these early cyberneticians operated under. 11. The left must develop socio-technological hegemony both in the sphere of ideas and the sphere of material platforms. Platforms are the infrastructure of global society. They establish the basic parameters of what is possible, both behaviorally and ideologically. In this sense, they embody the material transcendental of society. They are what make possible particular sets of actions, relationships, and powers. While much of the current global platform is based towards capitalist social relations, this is not an inevitable necessity. These material platforms of production, finance, logistics, and consumption can and will be reprogrammed and reformatted toward post-capitalist ends. 12. We do not believe that direct action is sufficient to achieve any of this. The habitual tactics of marching, holding signs, and establishing temporary autonomous zones risk becoming comforting substitutes for effective success. At least we have done something, is the rallying cry of those who privilege self-esteem rather than effective action. The only criterion of a good tactic is whether it enables significant success or not. We must be done with fetishizing particular modes of action. Politics must be treated as a set of dynamic systems riven with conflict, adaptations, and counter-adaptations, and strategic arms races. This means that each individual type of political action becomes blunted and ineffective over time as other sides adapt. No given mode of political action is historically inviolable. Indeed, over time, there is an increasing need to discard familiar tactics as the forces and entities that are marshaled against learn to defend and counterattack them effectively. It is in part the contemporary left's inability to do so which lies close to the heart of the contemporary malaise. 13. The overwhelming privileging of democracy as process needs to be left behind. The fetishization of openness, horizontality, and inclusion of much of today's radical left set at the stage for ineffectiveness. Secrecy, verticality, and exclusion have their place as well as effective political action. They're not, of course, an exclusive one. 14. Democracy cannot be defined simply by its means, not via voting, discussion, or general assemblies. Real democracy must be defined by its goal, collective self-mastery. This is a project which must align politics with the legacy of the Enlightenment, to the extent that it is only through harnessing our ability to understand ourselves and our world better, our social, technical, economic, psychological world, that we can come to rule ourselves. We need to posit a collectively controlled, legitimate vertical authority in addition to distributed horizontal forms of sociality, to avoid becoming the slaves of either a tyrannical totalitarian centralism or a capricious emergent order beyond our control. The command of the plan must be married to the improvised order of the network. 15. We do not present any particular organization as the ideal means to embody these vectors. What is needed, what has always been needed, is an ecology of organizations, a pluralism of forces, resonating and feeding back on their comparative strengths. Sectarianism is the death knell of the left as much as centralization is, and in regard we continue to welcome experimentation with different tactics, even those we disagree with. 16. We have 3 medium-term concrete goals. First, we need to build an intellectual infrastructure mimicking the Montpellerian society of the neoliberal revolution. This is to be tasked with creating a new ideology, economic and social models, and a vision of the good to replace and surpass the emaciated ideas that rule over our world today. This is an infrastructure in the sense of requiring the construction of not just ideas, but institutions and material paths to inculcate, embody, and spread them. 17. We need to construct wide-scale media reform. In spite of the seeming democratization offered by the internet and social media, traditional media outlets remain crucial in the selection and framing of narratives, along with processing the funds to prosecute investigative journalism. Bringing these bodies as close as possible to popular control is crucial to undoing the current presentation of the state of things. 18. Finally, we need to reconstitute various forms of class power. Such a reconstitution must move beyond the notion that an organically generated global proletariat already exists, Instead, it must seek to knit together a desperate array of partial proletarian ideas, often embodied in post-Fordist forms of precarious labor. 19. Groups and individuals are already at work on each of these, but each is on their own insufficient. What is required is all three feeding back into one another, with each modifying the contemporary conjunction in such a way that the others become more and more effective. A positive feedback loop of infrastructural, ideological, social, and economic transformation, generating a new complex hegemony, a new post-capitalist techno-social platform. History demonstrates that it has always been a broad assemblage of tactics and organizations which has brought about systemic change. These lessons must be learned. 20. To achieve each of these goals on the most practical level, we hold that the accelerationist left must think more seriously about the flows of resources and money required to build an effective new political infrastructure. Beyond the, quote, people power of bodies in the streets, we require funding, whether from governments, institutions, think tanks, unions, or individual benefactors. We consider the location and conduction of such funding flows essential to beginning reconstructing an ecology of effective accelerationist left organizations. 21. We declare that only a Promethean politics of maximal mastery over society and its environment is capable of either dealing with global problems or achieving victory over capital. This mastery must be distinguished from the beloved of thinkers of the original Enlightenment. The clockwork universe of Laplace, so easily mastered given sufficient information, is long gone from the agenda of serious scientific understanding. But this is not to align ourselves with the tired residue of postmodernity, decrying mastery as proto-fascistic or authority as innately illegitimate. Instead, we propose that the problems besettling our planet and our species oblige us to refurbish mastery in a newly complex guise. Whilst we cannot predict the precise result of our actions, we can determine probabilistically likely ranges of outcomes. What must be coupled to such complex systems of analysis is a new form of action, improvisatory and capable of executing a design through a practice which works with the contingencies it discovers only in the course of its acting, and a politics and geosocial artistry and a cunning rationality, a form of abductive experimentation that seeks the best means to act in a complex world. 22. We need to revive the argument that was traditionally made for post-capitalism. Not only is capitalism an unjust and perverted system, but it is also a system that holds back progress. Our technological development is being suppressed by capitalism, as much as it has been unleashed. Accelerationism is the basic belief that these capacities can and should be let loose by moving beyond limitations imposed by capitalist society. The movement towards the surpassing of our current constraints must include more than simply a struggle for a more rationalistic global society. We believe it must also include recovering the dreams which transfixed many from the middle of the 19th century until the dawn of the neoliberal era, of the quest of Homo sapiens towards expansion beyond the limitations of the earth and our immediate bodily forms. These visions today are viewed as relics of a more innocent moment, yet they both diagnose the staggering lack of imagination in our own time. These visions today are viewed as relics of a more innocent moment, yet they both diagnose the staggering lack of imagination in our own time and offer the promise of a future that is effectively invigorating as well as intellectually energizing. After all, it is only a post-capitalist society made possible by an accelerationist politics which will ever be capable of delivering on the promissory note of the mid-20th century space programs, to shift beyond a world of minimal technical upgrades towards all-encompassing change, toward a time of collective self-mastery and the properly alien future that entails and enables, toward a completion of the Enlightenment project of self-criticism and self-mastery, rather than its elimination. 23. The choice facing us is severe, either a globalized post-capitalism or a slow fragmentation towards primitivism, perpetual crisis, and planetary ecological collapse. 24. The future needs to be constructed. It has been demolished by neoliberal capitalism and reduced to a cut-price promise of greater inequality, conflict, and chaos. This collapse in the idea of the future is symptomatic of the regressive historical status of our age, rather than, as cynics across the political spectrum would have us believe, a sign of skeptical maturity. What acceleration pushes towards is a future that is more modern, an alternative modernity that neoliberalism is inherently unable to generate. The future must be cracked open once again, unfastening our horizons towards the universal possibilities of the outside.